Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar Lunch and Learn today. My name is Patrick Hogan of Manley Burke Compliance. Barka Patel from Pro Bono Partnership of Ohio. She's going to get us started here today. Barka, there you are. Hey, how's it going?
Hi, Patrick. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As Patrick mentioned, I'm Barka Patel. I'm the Director of Education and Counsel at Pro Bono Partnership of Ohio. For those of you who don't know a lot about us, I'd like to spend a minute or two here to give you a little bit more information about us, starting with our mission. Powered by attorney volunteers, we strengthen our community by providing free business legal services and education to nonprofits. Who qualifies to become a client? Well, all of our clients are 501c3 nonprofits that meet the following criteria. They have to serve low-income or disadvantaged people or significantly enhance the quality of life in our neighborhoods. They have to be offering programs that have a demonstrable impact on the community. They have to be located in or serve the Cincinnati or Dayton areas. And they have to be unable to pay for legal services without a significant impairment to their program services. These are just some of the types of legal projects we handle, but as you can see, they range from fundraising to employment to contracts and real estate, really almost anything you can think of for which we can find a qualified and experienced attorney volunteer. The only thing we don't touch is litigation. These are some of the hallmarks of PBPO. Our clients can expect from us quality legal services from experienced company and law firm attorneys. They can expect to work with their own PBPO attorney that's skilled in the area of nonprofit law. This attorney will help the client identify legal issues, areas of potential risk, and to help implement best practices. We place matters with subject matter experts, and a PBPO attorney oversees each matter. And finally, educational outreach, just like the webinar that we're having here today. The one question or thing that we hear most from our nonprofit friends is we don't know what we don't know, and we absolutely agree with that. So it is our mission to provide low cost or free in-person seminars and webinars. These are typically geared towards nonprofit leaders and board members on a wide range of topics. And if you're signed up for our mailing list, you'll receive our Pro Bono Brief nonprofit legal news and the legal alerts that we publish. Again, if you'd like to become a client or you're interested in joining our mailing list, feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is here on this slide. And so I will want to hand it over to Patrick Hogan with Manley Burke. Patrick is incredibly experienced in this area of law. He does it all the time, and we're so thrilled to be able to have him share his time and his expertise with us. I know, Patrick, is there an option for them to put in questions if they have them during the presentation?
Yeah, definitely. You can use the chat function or the Q&A. There should be some time at the end for questions, but if you have a question as we're going, feel free to type it in there, and I'll do my best to monitor it and answer as we go.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
All right. So like Barka said, my name is Patrick Hogan. I'm president of Manley Burke Compliance, so Manley Burke Compliance, it's an affiliate of the law firm Manley Burke. And so the compliance end, we handle really the nuts and bolts of running a business, so running a nonprofit. So you can really focus on your organization's mission. In both the law firm Manley Burke and Manley Burke Compliance, we have vast experience in working with nonprofits. And like Barka said, I'm here today to discuss charitable registration. So please don't fall asleep on me. I know it's not the most exciting topic, but it is important to understand. So again, if you have any questions, we'll have some time at the end, but also feel free to ask as we go, and I'll be able to answer. And then if you see me looking off to my right, that's my colleague, Mindy Reynolds. She's just here to help me with any of the technical stuff. Okay, so today's agenda. So I guess really we should just start off with what is charitable registration. And really it was designed by the states to weed out fraudulent charities. and it creates a database in each state for that state's citizens to look at that database and find out how their donations are spent with a particular charity. Because no donor wants to spend $10 making a donation where 90% of that $10 goes to the employees versus the programs of that charity. And so today we're going to cover the requirements. So what triggers registration, any potential exemptions from registration, penalties and late fees if your organization does not register, increased enforcement by states, the uniform registration statement and other state-specific requirements I've seen, the timing of registration, which can be important, and we'll touch a little bit on professional fundraisers and consultants. So generally, a tax-exempt organization that intends to solicit charitable contributions from the general public is required to register with 41 states and the District of Columbia. And again, this is just a way for these states and DC to weed out fraudulent charities and to provide their citizens with the ability to make informed decisions. And so whether your tax-exempt organization is required to register in a particular state, it really depends on three factors. Whether your tax-exempt organization is soliciting charitable contributions within that state, if the organization has hired professional fundraisers to assist in fundraising, and then from whom contributions are sought. And I'm going to work backwards on this one a little bit. So the third point, it just means that your tax-exempt organization, it could be exempt from registering if it's only soliciting from within its own membership or a very specific class of people. But that's all just very specific to the state that your organization is soliciting in. And then point number two, in most states, if your organization hires a professional fundraiser, so that could be a fundraising consultant or a fundraising solicitor, that likely triggers the requirement to register in that state. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're seeking some third parties to help with your soliciting. And then one thing also that most people probably don't realize is that you don't necessarily have to be a 501c3 to register. You can be a C7, C5. It just depends on why your organization is soliciting those donations and what it plans to do with those donations. So any nonprofit may have to register. And so now back to the first point, let's start with if solicitation takes place within that state, your organization likely has to register in that state. But one thing also, remember that the solicitation, it has to be for charitable contributions to trigger that registration. So if your organization is a C7, but it's not seeking charitable contributions, it most likely does not have to register. And so really this all boils down to what is a solicitation. In states, they have it's different for every state, but they're all very expansive definitions of solicitation. For example, I'll use Kentucky because I know a lot of your organizations are based in Cincinnati, so you likely do reach across the Ohio River and make some solicitations, even if you don't know that you are. So Kentucky defines solicitation as the act of requesting, directly or indirectly, that an addressed person or limited audience or the public generally make a contribution. Solicitation shall be deemed to have taken place when the request is made, whether or not the requested contribution is made. So you can see that the act of soliciting in Kentucky is quite broad, and most states do have a similar definition. If you have a donate here button, you may be considered soliciting in a state. And so one question I get asked the most is what exactly counts as a solicitation? And the answer is it's a lot of activities. Does your tax exempt organization maintain a website with the donate here button? that could trigger it, because if you have, a citizen of Kentucky coming onto your website, clicking that donate here button, that person's in Kentucky, so you're soliciting from someone in Kentucky. The others are pretty straightforward. Does your organization send out mailers, pamphlets, flyers, and magazines? Many do, and those could be being mailed all over the country. Does your organization send out emails that include a request for contribution? So again, even if your organization is based in Ohio, you're likely reaching across the border into other states asking for a contribution. Does your organization hold fundraising events outside of Ohio? That's always a trigger. If you're going physically into another state, your organization will have to register there. And again, I think the point is that the definition of solicitation in almost all states is very broad, and it really covers almost any ask for a charitable contribution. So what happens if you are soliciting while not registered, or if you fail to even register after receiving contributions? There's several adverse consequences your organization could run into. There's the potential for monetary fines and penalties, personal liability against directors, enjoyment from soliciting funds. So meaning your organization can no longer solicit charitable contributions in that state. Negative PR, damaged relationships with donors and potential donors, as well as potential for lost donations or grants. So although registration, it's complicated, it takes a lot of time. It really is important to do this work up front so you can avoid these adverse consequences. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, these requirements, they're the law, and they're passed and enforced by states to protect their residents from fraudulent charities. And following the law and maintaining compliance is important in the nonprofit world, where community standards and a premium on reputation are particularly high. And so another question I get often is our organization exempt from registering in certain states? And again, it really depends on the state that you're looking at, but generally, exemptions, they're very narrowly tailored, and they really depend on the purpose of the solicitation. So if your organization is soliciting only from its members, it may be exempt in some states, or sometimes most states have exemptions for like Fraternal Order of Police, Fraternal Order of Fire, groups like that. But generally, your organization is not going to be exempt from registering, but you'll just have to consult the law in each specific state to determine that. And so what I often hear from organizations is, well, if we don't register, what could really happen? I don't know. It really depends on that state and what your organization was doing, how much contributions it received. But I can say with certainty that I've noticed that states have really increased their enforcement. I've had several clients receive letters from state agencies regarding their registration, or really their lack of registration. Following are a couple examples. So this was a letter from California to a client. It's basically saying your organization should be registered. In California, they were right. We never really know what triggered this letter. And we got our client registered, and they were assessed a small fine. Okay, so just one moment here. I have a question from Rick Hoffman. If we receive a grant from an out of Ohio entity, do we have to register in the state of the grantor? If so, should we do this before applying for the grant? So unfortunately, it really depends on the state, and sometimes even the organization making the grant, they may, as part of the grant application, require your organization to be registered. But if you're not really actively soliciting for that grant, you may not have to register. It really depends on that out-of-state organization. So Rick, maybe we can discuss this later with some more specifics. Okay, so the next slide. So this is a similar letter, but it's from the Kansas Attorney General. And this one was interesting. We do know who filed the complaint. It was a disgruntled ex-employee. And this person sent similar complaints saying that the charity was not registered. He sent it to all 50 states, even though not all 50 states require registration. But luckily, the charity, they were already in the process of getting registered, so there were really no fines. And from what I've found in my experience, the states, they'll kind of take it easy on an organization as long as your organization is in the process of trying to get registered and be compliant. And so really the moral of this story is be aware. You never know when or how a state will find out whether a charity is registered, and the states, they have the authority to assess fines or even enjoin your organization from soliciting contributions in that state ever again, which that could be major depending on the state. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the 990, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with in the nonprofit world. And I just wanted to point this out because there's another way that states can learn whether an organization is registered, and that's within the 990. So tax-exempt organizations are required to file their Form 990 in most states where they are required to register as part of the annual renewal requirement. So if your charity, your tax-exempt organization is registered in Kentucky, it has to file the 990 with Kentucky every single year. And you'll see that on part 6 of the 990, which is up on the screen, you have to report what states the 990 gets filed in. So in this instance, on the 990, your organization is self-reporting its registration status. And remember, the 990, it's posted online, it's open to public disclosure, so anybody can see this, including all 50 states and DC. And then there's a second part of the 990, and it specifically asks about charitable registration. And this is on Schedule G. So an organization that reports more than $15,000 of expenses for professional fundraising services must complete Schedule G, Part 1. So your organization may not file this every year, but most larger organizations do have to file it, and you'll see it's not saying does your organization file the 990, it's where is your organization registered or exempt. So again, it's another spot on the 990 where you're self-reporting your registration status. And then something else to be aware of, this really started a few years ago. So as I've discussed, states, some are starting to really ramp up their enforcement. The ones I've seen the most are North Carolina, Pennsylvania, California, New Jersey. They've really in the past year or two seemed to have really upped their enforcement of state charitable registration. In this threat, it's also enhanced by the IRS's stated goal of increased sharing of information between states and federal taxing authorities. And this really just means that the IRS and state agencies are openly sharing information back and forth as needed. The next slide, this is an example of the increased sharing of information between the states and the IRS. So this is a letter from Ohio to a client. So as you can see, Ohio specifically indicates that a review of its records and information from the IRS led it to determine that the organization may be required to register. Ohio does not say exactly how they made the determination, but presumably it's from information included in the 990 since they cite to the IRS. So it's really just something to keep in mind as you're kind of working through the registration process, is that states and the IRS are working together to determine who should or should not be registered. Okay, so now that we've established that most nonprofit organizations are required to register, are most likely not covered by an exemption in most states, and that the states and IRS are increasing focus on compliance with state solicitation statutes, Let's turn to the registration process and how that works, what it entails. So we'll start with the unified registration statement. So unfortunately, the registration process, it's not as simple as filling out one standard form and then just mailing it to all states in DC. There was an attempt at this. The multi-state filer project was organized by the National Association of State Charities officials and the National Association of Attorney Generals. The goal was to standardize and simplify compliance under the state's solicitation laws. And one of the major products of this was the Unified Registration Statement, the URS. And the idea was to have one form that every state would accept. And this worked out for a little bit. It sounds great in theory, but unfortunately, each state has its own different laws. So it hasn't exactly worked out. And unfortunately, since the creation of the URS, several states have just abandoned the URS, but there's still a decent amount of states that do use the standard URS form, which it can make things a little bit easier on your organization to use the standard form instead of doing each state's very specific forms. Okay, so one question from Lisa Jones Graham. I'm a little bit confused about the registration process. If you are already registered as a nonprofit 501c3 org operating in Ohio, do you still have to register again for fundraising or solicitation of funds? The short answer is yes. So we'll go back. So a nonprofit organization gets its nonprofit status from the state. So your organization filed articles of incorporation with the state of Ohio, which granted it its nonprofit status. And then the next step is your organization, once you become a nonprofit within a state, you have to file for exemption to obtain that 501c3 status with the IRS. So you become a nonprofit with the state, you become tax exempt through the IRS. And then on top of that, if your organization is soliciting, that's a totally different registration process. That's just all through the Ohio Attorney General, and you have to renew that registration annually. And yes, so Ohio and Kentucky, neither. So Ohio is all online. They do not use the URS. Kentucky, you can use the URS initially for the initial registration, but after that, you can no longer use the URS. So again, it gets a little confusing when you start going into each and every state. Indiana does not require registration at all. So no worries there. Okay, so there are many state-specific requirements, even for those states accepting a URS, including state-specific forms or supplements to the URS. And I'm just going to give a few examples just so you can kind of understand what all the registration process entails, and it can be a lot. So here's DC, which of course DC makes it very complicated. DC has a 3-step registration process, where first your organization has to obtain a certificate of authority just to do business within DC. Once that's approved, the organization has to register and apply for exemption with the DC Office of Tax and Revenue. And then the third leg is once that's approved, your organization has to apply for a basic business license in DC. And again, just sharing some things I've come across. DC can be pretty complicated. North Dakota, this is another one. And this is really, usually you don't register in North Dakota unless you have a nationwide charity. But this is just an example of what you may run into. So in North Dakota, before your organization can register to solicit charitable contributions, it has to apply for and receive a certificate of authority to do business within North Dakota. And of course, that certificate of authority has to be renewed every single year, which is different than the charitable registration process. And then there have been some improvements. More and more states are moving their registration online, which it's more convenient, but it can be a bit more work because the person who's filling out the form online, it's data entry, and it can take a while to upload, all the revenue, expenses, board members throughout the year, where on the paper forms, you can kind of just attach those to the paper form and mail it off. So it may be a little bit easier now that each state is moving online, but it doesn't get that much easier. So there's another question. So the annual filing, so what happens is your organization, so we'll just say, for example, Ohio, your organization registers with the Ohio Attorney General. So that then your organization can legally solicit charitable contributions in Ohio. However, that registration, it's kind of like a license. You have to renew it each year. And in Ohio, the renewal coincides with the 990 due date. So when your 990 is due, so is the renewal of your Ohio charitable solicitation registration. And of course, there's a small fee that has to be paid with that renewal. So charitable registration, it never stops. It's once you're registered, you have to renew it each year. Okay, and so if you're getting into the registration process, here are some of the documents that you'll need. So if you're working on this, you can kind of start collecting some of these documents. And what I wanted to point out was the audit, especially for newer organizations or smaller organizations. In most charitable registration renewals, or even the initial registration, if your organization meets a certain threshold of either contributions or revenue, your organization has to provide an audit during the renewal or the registration. And like I said, this can be a surprise for either newer organizations or smaller groups that have never done an audit before. And so it's just something to be aware of as your organization grows and revenue increases. Because it can be a pain to all of a sudden say, oh, we need an audit and we need it fast, and it can be expensive. So just something to think about. And so again, just to reiterate, there's each state, they have their own laws, they have their own requirements. And now timing, and this is important, but it won't make or break your organization registering. It's just a little tip I have. So the best time to register, if you've never registered before, is to coincide that registration with the 990 due date, because once you're registered, like we just discussed, your organization is going to have to renew that registration. And if you file the initial registration with outdated financials, all of a sudden your organization will be registered, but then 2 months later, it's going to have to renew its registration. So it's best to start the registration process right when the 990 is filed, so you have an entire year before you have to file the renewal. Okay, so I see there's some questions about the financial threshold for audited financial statements. And like everything, it matters. It depends on the state. I want to say the lowest threshold, but I'd have to double check, is $500,000. So if your organization has, and this would be Illinois. So if your tax exempt organization has $500,000 in contributions and it's trying to register in Illinois, it will need an audit. But generally, most states, you start to see the threshold kick in at 750,000 or $1 million. So again, the consequences of using outdated financials, it's not bad, it's okay. It just means that you may have a short renewal period. And it's just, added work on your end. And then, so I want to touch on professional fundraisers and consultants, because I've found this causes a lot of confusion. One of the questions most states ask is for the tax exempt organization to list all of the outside fundraising professionals that it uses. And remember, if your organization uses a professional fundraiser, that likely triggers registration within that state. And most states also require your tax exempt organization to attach a copy of the contract with that fundraising professional. And most people, they don't realize that professional fundraisers have to be registered to act on behalf of a nonprofit organization. If a fundraising professional engaged by the organization is not properly registered, this can cause problems for both the fundraiser and the tax exempt organization. So the states will be put on notice that the fundraiser is not registered, which can result in the imposition of fines and the fundraiser being enjoined from further solicitation activity until it registers. And this is because in most states, it's unlawful for a charitable organization to engage the services of an unregistered fundraiser. And really, many fundraising professionals believe that they're not subject to the registration requirements because they do not actually solicit. So they're not out there face-to-face soliciting on behalf of the tax exempt organization. But they may be wrong, because most states, they define fundraising consultants, as you can see here, and it's a fairly broad definition and scope. So it really includes most fundraising professionals, even if they don't engage in direct solicitation. So companies that are not fundraising professionals, so not all companies providing services to charities with respect to solicitation campaigns or materials fall within these definitions. Companies that do not provide advice or have any discretion with respect to the content of the solicitation or to whom solicitations is sent. I think that might answer the question in the chat box. And then the next slide is, these are some examples of companies I often see that are misidentified as professional fundraisers. So like mailing houses, they're not fundraisers. They're just, receiving a template, mailing it for you, printing it for you, and that's it. You really need a fundraising consultant is really someone who actively helps manage a campaign, maybe design the materials or has say into how the campaign is run. And then back to the 990, which is the life of a nonprofit. Fees paid to companies that do not meet the IRS definition of professional fundraising services should not be reported on Part 9, Line 11E, or on the Schedule G. And I see this on 990s a lot, where say a print house, they get reported as a professional fundraiser. And this is where you see it on the 990. And something to be aware of is if a fundraiser so if your organization lists a fundraiser on the 990, but you don't list the fundraiser on the state registration forms, states will see this as an inconsistency and they'll request copies of the contracts so they can conduct their own investigation regarding whether the company should have been reported whether the professional fundraiser should have been reported by the tax exempt organization, and if so, whether the fundraiser is properly registered. So, if your organization reports a mailing house, you're not going to get in trouble for that, but it may create a headache for you just to have to deal with a state agency and explaining all this to them. And so here are some suggestions when dealing with an unregistered professional fundraiser. Because again, a lot of states, it's against the law for a charity to contract with an unregistered professional fundraiser. I would say the most important one is item 3. You can add into a contract an indemnification clause in case there are any fees or penalties incurred because your fundraiser was not properly registered. And then most states also have requirements that fundraising contracts have to meet. And most people don't realize this. Most fundraisers don't even realize this, I see. And so if the organization attaches a copy of a fundraising contract to its registration form, which does not comply with the state's requirements, both the organization and the fundraiser will be at the risk of penalties. So it's always important to review that contract up, before it's signed to make sure it is complying with various state laws that you'll be soliciting in. And then I've touched on this earlier. After the organization's initial registration is accepted, the organization must annually renew that registration. In the process, it's pretty similar to the initial registration in that you file a form, you prepare a form, you attach 990, possibly the audit, and then pay a small filing fee. And this is done every year until you're no longer soliciting in that state. All right, and so that is all I have for you. Here's my contact information. If you have any, real specific questions, feel free to give me a call or email me and we can chat further. I know I think I've answered all the questions in the chat. Are there any other questions? So a contracted grant writer, I would have to double check, but they most likely would not be soliciting on behalf of the tax exempt organization. But again, it really depends on your state. But if they're just out there writing grants, they're not soliciting the general public. But again, we could talk about that one offline. All right, I think that is it. So I hope thanks so much for joining me. I hope you've learned a lot. And again, here's my contact information if you have any questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And thanks, Manley Burke Compliance. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.